We should move on to a topic that you are particularly well-versed in, is what I was trying to say. I think I can just probably say it. It's a college football podcast. It's not an Indiana podcast. You grew up an Ohio State fan. I'm worse. I grew up a Purdue fan. I got that Purdue bear in the background to, commemorate that time in my life. So you're very familiar with Ohio State, and that's way more relevant than Purdue in this situation because Ohio State is favorites to win the Big Ten this season, and it's not a small gap. At least what I saw out of FanDuel, I believe it's plus 190 for Ohio State, plus 270 for Oregon, and I'm not too into betting, so I don't know if that's like a really large gap or not. But regardless, Ohio State is the favorite, and you probably know a lot about Ohio State. And so for our Big Ten segment, I think we should do a little State of the Buckeyes address. Let's talk about the Buckeyes. Do they deserve to be the favorites? How much of a favorite are they? What's going on with Ohio State as they look to avenge a Big Ten championship loss against Indiana and avenge a college football playoff loss as well and get back to the national championship for what would be the second time in 3 years, which I just realized if that happens, that would certainly be a storyline by the end of the season.
Yeah, I mean, Ohio State, pretty much for the past 20 years, they've been national championship contenders almost year in and year out. I think they got a lot better. Julian Sayin coming back for his second year under center, I think that does a lot for this team. They do lose a lot of guys to the NFL. Arvell Reese, Sonny Styles, Caleb Downs. So replacing those guys will be difficult, but it's year 2 under Matt Patricia for that defense as well. I think Jalen McClain, the safety, he'll have to step up. Peyton Pierce, the linebacker, he'll have to step up. And on that D-line, Kenyatta Jackson Jr. coming back for his senior year, I think that'll really help the Buckeyes. But offensively, it's also another NFL guy as the new offensive coordinator, Arthur Smith, former head coach in the NFL. He is the Ohio State Buckeyes' new offensive coordinator. And when you have, in my opinion, the best player in college football to work with in Jeremiah Smith, I think it makes life a lot easier when you're adjusting to a new program, a new, going from the NFL to college. So obviously an entirely new ball game. So Arthur Smith, he has a lot of tools, especially in that backfield when you have Bo Jackson as the running back. Obviously not the famous Hall of Famer Bo Jackson, but this Bo Jackson going into his second year, he really dominated Michigan last year in the big games, and I think he'll have to make that big jump forward in the backfield. You also bring in Legend Bay, but I want to talk a little bit about the schedule from the Buckeyes. They play week 1 against Ball State at home, but week 2 is that rematch. I don't know if you remember week 1 last year, Ohio State, Texas in Ohio Stadium. Ohio State won 14-7, and what a lot of people call just a defensive battle, but a lot of people had a lot of things to say about Arch Manning and Texas. Texas opens up as the favorites by 1.5 points at home this year. I think that's going to be one of the best games of the college football season. I mean, regardless of however you want to look at it, it's the third time Ohio State and Texas have met in the past 3 years. If you remember that college football playoff game, the semifinal, the Cotton Bowl, when Ohio State beat Texas on their way to the national championship in 2024. But now Ohio State, Julian Sayin, second year, Arch Manning, second year as the starter, so I think that game is going to be exciting. But then when you move into conference play, Ohio State, Illinois, Ohio State, Iowa, Ohio State, Indiana, in my opinion, is the game I'm just the most excited for. Obviously, I said I grew up an Ohio State fan. My entire family's from Columbus, Ohio. My mom went to Ohio State. It's just something that when I grew up, my mom put an Ohio State jersey on, but coming to Indiana, I didn't know what to expect from the football, and I might have just walked into, I might just be one of the luckiest guys ever going and doing sports media. So Ohio State, after Indiana, plays USC on the road, and then they welcome Oregon the next week. So that is a brutal 3-week span for Ohio State, similar to Indiana's 3-week span, but for Ohio State, they start on the road at Indiana, and then go on the road at USC, then welcome Oregon at home. So brutal 3-game stretch for the Buckeyes, and obviously end the year against Michigan. But I expect this Ohio State team to be 1 or 2 losses throughout the entire season, just because Ryan Day doesn't seem to drop that many regular season games. I think his struggles have really come in the postseason. So I'm excited to see what the Buckeyes bring to the table, and it's definitely interesting that Vegas has them as the favorites in the conference.
Absolutely. And that you make a good point about the strength of the schedule. I honestly didn't notice that till I looked at it. But according to ESPN FBI, it's the toughest schedule in the Big Ten. It's the 8th toughest schedule in the country. Obviously, that's partially because they go on the road to Texas in the non-conference. I'm glad you mentioned that really tough stretch with Indiana, USC, and Oregon. It's at the same time as Indiana's tough stretch, as you mentioned there. Slightly staggered, but end of October, early November, whereas Indiana's is really just the middle and the end of October. But it's a lot of the same teams, right? Indiana and Ohio State obviously play one another. Ohio State goes to USC, back home for Oregon. Later on in the year, at Nebraska and Michigan. Illinois as well, at Iowa. I mean, I think there's only 2, I'd say 4 games that you could consider like automatic wins where they'll be super heavily favored. Home against Maryland, home against Northwestern, home against Kent State, and home against Ball State, I think are those 4 wins. And you could totally at least expect an upset in every other, or not expect, but you could totally reasonably pick an upset or predict an upset in any other one of those games, regardless of how strong Ohio State is. So it speaks to, I guess, the strength of the Big Ten in some ways, because not every Big Ten schedule really represents that and displays that. But this Ohio State schedule clearly does. And yeah, the Texas game will be awesome. I didn't watch that game last year because I watched the highlights, but I was at Indiana Old Dominion. I was in the studio for WIUX, student radio station. So I was aware of the score. I was aware of what was going on. But for the most part, I was involved with Indiana Old Dominion. I'm sure you were watching Ohio State, Texas. I don't think I know where you were, but I guess that makes sense if you weren't there at Indiana at Memorial Stadium.
Yeah, I watched the entire game, and it was really back and forth in terms of momentum. Obviously, the score 14-7, it doesn't show you a whole lot, but that's when we really found out how good Ohio State's defense was last year. And Ohio State's defense, when you compare them to Indiana's defense last year, obviously we saw in that Big Ten championship game, it was a low-scoring 13-10 win for Indiana. And Ohio State's defense was really, really solid last year. They also had, 3 guys go in the top 12 in the NFL draft this past year. So that just shows the amount of talent on the roster. But they replace them with a lot of great players. Riley Pettijohn, I think, is going to step into that big, solid linebacker role for Ohio State, where they lose Sonny Styles, they lose Arvell Reese. But Riley Pettijohn, an Ohio kid, I think he's going to have to step into that. I mean, fill in those shoes for Ohio State. And I have a lot of confidence in Pettijohn. I think he has the size, but also he's playing under Matt Patricia's defense, which they showed out in Matt Patricia's first year in Columbus. So a lot of guys on that roster, on that defense, who will have to step into new roles. But when you are at Ohio State, that's just the expectation, and that's been the expectation throughout the program's history of you just have to step in and show up. Where, obviously we cover Indiana, and we see a lot of that what goes on in Bloomington. I'm not saying that that's not the expectation in Bloomington, but Indiana's success is a lot more recent. Curt Cignetti is trying to build the program into one of the mainstays in college football, and to do that, he has to look in his own conference at programs with winning history like Ohio State, programs like Michigan for the most part, and even the programs that Curt Cignetti has been around in Alabama. He knows exactly the expectation. Not to bring this back to Indiana, but Ohio State has that blueprint set for the Big Ten schools. And I think in this 2026 season, any school who is able to have a returning quarterback or a quarterback with experience, I think you're sitting pretty here, and especially in the Big Ten Conference with Julian Sayin, Dante Moore. I'll even throw Josh Hoover in there because he has some of the most amount of starts, I believe, or maybe first or second most amount of starts in college football. When you have a quarterback with experience, I think that matters a lot in the Big Ten Conference. Ohio State has that, Oregon has that, and Indiana have that. All obviously the top 3 favored for the Big Ten Conference.
Absolutely. This Ohio State team will be interesting to watch. Obviously Ryan Day got that national championship. So many coaches at the top level are criticized for not being able to win the big one. And then once, it's almost like a fireable offense if they're not able to win the big one. And then the second they do, they're one of the greatest coaches of all time. And it's a major, major jump. And so Ryan Day's made that jump, and now looking to get back there and do it again. Again, second time in 3 years. We've had so much of a discussion about Indiana, but also Ohio State to win 2 in 3 years would be a super major, storyline. That's something that I'm kind of interested in with the WNBA. This is a bit ridiculous, a bit of a ridiculous tie-in, but you have the Aces and the Lynx. On one hand, the Aces can win 4 titles in 5 years, which is a huge deal. But at the same time this season, the Minnesota Lynx could win 2 titles in 3 years, just like Ohio State. So especially if that's the WNBA finals, like you have 2 potentially like super significant runs, like dynastic runs running at the same time, specifically if the Lynx win a championship, because then it's 2 of the last 3, while the Aces have won 3 of the last 5 if the Lynx win the championship. That's just something I'm interested in with the WNBA. And it's kind of like that here in the Big Ten as well, where if Indiana and Ohio State kind of alternate at the top, obviously with Oregon and teams like that mixed in, that could be super fun to watch over the course of the next half decade or so. Ohio State also, according to FanDuel, is the favorite to win the national championship. And I was listening to the Andy and Ari on 3 podcast on the way to Bloomington yesterday, and I heard something. I mentioned that because I feel like I have to credit them for this, because I wouldn't have thought of this on my own. But the goal is to win a national championship, obviously, but the true final form of evolution for an elite program is to be universally the best over the course of time, meaning you're favored to win your conference and you're favored to win the national championship before the season. Over the course of the season, maybe you're undefeated, but regardless, you're universally considered the best team, and then you actually win the national championship. So from July to January, you're the best team, and you're the team that's expected to win the national championship, and you actually do it. Ohio State has a chance to do that this year. Really the only team that truly has a chance to do that, because only one team can be the favorite to win the national championship at the top, at least this season, because there's no tie in that category. So Ohio State has the opportunity to really go all the way wire to wire, I suppose, in terms of the perception of who's likely to win the national championship. Really tough schedule, so it'll be interesting to see if they can actually do it. Ohio State at Indiana is a game that is, you mentioned Ohio State and Texas is maybe the best game of the year. I think Ohio State Indiana could be that. I'm sure you're obviously not going to vehemently disagree with that idea, but I forget about it. This is what happens when you're covering football and men's basketball at the same time, is sometimes you think about one more on a given week, sometimes you forget about the other for a little bit, and just little things like that, like, oh, right, Ohio State's going to Indiana this year. I haven't thought about it in like a month. I haven't thought about that game in a while. And now it's just a reminder that that's going to be an unbelievable day or night, whenever that game is, probably noon. And
Probably noon.
Yeah, that'll be a thrill. Yeah, probably noon. You make a good point. That's the other nice thing with Indiana, with us, is now that Indiana's more likely to get big noon kickoff on days, then it's more likely that we're able to watch the primetime games. I'm thrilled about week 1 because best day ever, right? You go to Indiana, North Texas, you write about it, and then you get home, you're on the couch, you're with your friends, you're watching Clemson LSU, I believe it is, or whatever else whatever other primetime games there are that night. So we'll have more opportunities like that rather than 4 o'clock Big Ten Network kickoffs where you really can't truly pay attention to full games anywhere else on the slate. But yeah, so that'll be interesting. But yeah, Ohio State in a good place. We'll be excited to monitor that, and you're in a great place too, as you mentioned, like super lucky. Even just because, for me, it's not even excitement about because covering Indiana, right? Naturally, obviously, I would enjoy going to the Rose Bowl, for example. But also some of those fun matchups. Like 2 years ago, Indiana, Notre Dame, whoever was there to cover that for the Hoosier Network and these sports media organizations that we're now involved with, that must have been an awesome environment and a really cool experience. And so matchups like that, Ohio State, Texas is really, really cool. But you kind of get to, you're well-versed in 2 playoff runs in some cases. And it's not like you're a fan like trying to cheer for Indiana. Obviously, we cover that team neutrally. It's just interesting to see, you get to watch Indiana, Alabama, and you get to watch, Ohio State, Miami, or whatever it may be. And so some of those major, great, historic blue blood programs in college football that, I'm not used to actually watching the team I'm covering or the team I'm most involved with play against because, I grew up a Purdue fan, right? Ohio State was pretty much the only one, and that one win in 2018 is pretty much the only memory I have that's positive for being a kid cheering for Purdue. But, Ohio State plays those teams all the time, and that's those fun, awesome, major matchups happen all the time. And now Indiana's at that level too. So it'll be interesting to monitor both of those teams. Obviously, I'm exponentially more well versed in Indiana compared to Ohio State at this point. Yours are a little bit more even, but Ohio State's obviously going to be a noteworthy team to discuss over the course of the season by nature of them being the favorites to win the Big Ten and the national championship.